Three, two, one.
Well, good morning, listeners and everybody joining us this morning for another edition of 1Berkshire's virtual town hall series. My name is Jonathan Butler, and I'm the president and CEO of 1Berkshire, and I have taken on part of the responsibilities for hosting some of these sessions, and I'll be your moderator this morning. This morning, we're actually going to take a quick break from the COVID crisis, which we've been covering really on a weekly basis across a range of different topics and disciplines. And we're gonna focus today on a different, very popular issue in the business community, and that's the recent updates and some changes made to the paid family medical leave program. This obviously has been a very busy topic in HR offices and within the administration of businesses in the last year in Massachusetts. There's a lot of moving pieces. So today we actually have an excellent panel that's going to go through some of those recent updates and then be available to answer some questions for all of us. But before we start, I do want to just give a little bit of an overview. I'll let everybody know that this session, as is all of our sessions, is being recorded and will be made available for for listening both virtually and through local television broadcasts in the coming week or two, so more people can actually have an opportunity to access this content. And our format this morning will be about a 30 to 45 minute panel discussion, and when that starts to wrap up organically, we'll shift to some questions. Listeners have an opportunity to submit questions in two ways. There's a Q&A function on your screen that you can submit a written question to, which we will look through. And there's also a chat section where you can submit questions. And what we would encourage is that you try to think of questions that are specific in nature, so that we can answer some things that a number of different businesses are probably having interest in. So, anyways. Moving on from our overview, I'd like to introduce our panel, and we have a great group this morning, and I'm so grateful that they're taking the time to join us. First off, we actually have the director of the Massachusetts Department of Family and Medical Leave, Bill Alpine, who's joining us virtually. Thank you, Bill. We have
thanks for having me, Jonathan.
And we have Kevin Kinne, who's a partner at Cohen, Kinne, Valicenti, and Cook.
Hey, Jonathan, thank you very much. I really appreciate you and 1Berkshire doing these. These have been great. I've been watching some of the other ones, and it's really helpful.
Great to have you. And Kevin's been doing tremendous work in our region for a long time, helping a lot of businesses navigate some complex issues like this one today. And then also we have Michele Morin, who's the Vice President of HR and Workforce at Hillcrest Educational Centers. Good morning, Michele.
Good morning, everyone, and happy Friday.
And Hillcrest, one of the larger employers in the Berkshires, I'm sure, has had a lot of complex navigation of this issue. So we're interested to hear from Michele. So with that, we're going to move right into kind of letting our panelists introduce themselves. So please take a few minutes and let us know sort of what about your role, about your work, and then also how this paid family medical leave issue has been on your desk in the recent year plus. And why don't we start off with Bill?
Well, that's easy. It's the only thing that's been on my desk in the last year and a half. So yeah, I'm Bill Alpine. I'm the director of the DFML program. I took that position in February of 2019. I came into the program right in the thick of things when we were putting out our first set of draft regulations. And then throughout that process, we finalized our regs last summer for the first time. Many people are asking why we're redoing our regs right now. Well, it's because of the sessions like this that we've been doing around the state, that we've been alerted to a number of issues or concerns, things we can be doing differently, things we can be saying differently in our regulations. So we've heard your suggestions, and we've incorporated those into the draft regulations that we just published in May. We had our public hearing on them last week. I'm in the process right now reviewing about 90 comments from approximately 40 different entities. And there's definitely more information that's going to be coming out of that process as we start digging in. I'm trying to get these things finalized by July. And, there's a lot of work ahead of me and my team to do so. The other thing that we're working on is getting the claims administration system in process. And we're working with some vendors to do that. So I won't take up any more time on giving an explanation of what's going on from the DFML standpoint. I'm sure it'll all come out through conversation here today.
Well, thanks for that, Bill, and thank you for your work. This is obviously an important program and very complex to navigate. So, we appreciate you taking the time this morning to join us. Why don't we shift over to Michele?
Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Michele Morin. I'm the Vice President of HR Workforce Development for Hillcrest Educational Centers. We're a large nonprofit organization here in the Berkshires that provides care and services for intensely special needs students in 3 residential programs and 1 day school program. I have been, as all of you business owners or businesses and HR personnel have been actively focusing on the mass paid family medical leave since it was signed into effect, I think around 2018. Lots of webinars, lots of workshops, lots of conversations with employer associations, just to try to wrap our mind around logistically how this is going to be implemented, what this means for our organization in regard to staff being out for extended periods of time, and also trying to focus on the positive aspects, of this leave, providing financial support for people who are out for extended periods of time. Certainly a challenging time for all of us. If you're an HR person in the room, you've already been through quite a bit. The last 2.5 months, 3 months have been pretty interesting. So I won't say that the paid leave pales in comparison to what we've been through, with all the COVID-19 stuff that has happened to us, but we certainly have had to absorb a lot of policies and changes in a very short period of time. So I'm interested in being able to talk a little bit about our employers' experience with the mass paid leave so far. We've also picked a private plan versus paying into the state. So I know that that's probably one of the questions or areas that we'll talk about a little bit later, and I can kind of share experience with that.
Great, thanks for those thoughts, Michele. Kevin?
Thanks, Jonathan. My name is Kevin Kinne. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm really happy to be here and really happy to also participate with Michele and Bill. I have been practicing employment law since I first got out of law school. I began at a large firm in Boston right out of law school, and that's all I did was employment law. My wife and I moved back to the Berkshires. We're both Berkshire natives, and we moved back to the Berkshires to start our family, and it's been the best thing we could have ever done, and been happy to continue to represent employers since I've moved back, and employment law is my primary area of practice. And I have to say, the employment law landscape has changed dramatically since I first started. There's been so many additions, both state and federal, to the employment law landscape, and this one is one of the more important ones. And also, with, as Michele mentioned, with COVID-19 happening and the mix of the federal laws and the state laws combining, there's a whole myriad of different issues that you have to consider anytime someone is asking about leave, and they're even more complicated now. So I was really happy to get the call to participate in the panel today, not just to share my perspective, but also to hear Michele and Bill's thoughts on it. So I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Jonathan.
Well, once again, thanks to each of you for taking the time this morning at 8:30 on Friday morning. We're a little earlier this week than usual, but it's good to have some listeners on and have this conversation. So the reason why we thought to include this particular topic into our town hall series was we've actually just recently been getting a lot of outreach from our membership, which is over 900 businesses strong, and from other organizations in the Berkshires, just around what we're doing, what we know about the changes, what people need to be thinking about right now. So I think a good first topic would just be to talk about some of those a little bit more high level. The proposed regulations, how have they changed, specifically as far as the amount of leave in total that can be taken by employees, and how you might anticipate some of these changes impacting local businesses. So maybe we start that topic with Bill with a little bit of some of his thoughts, and you guys can sort of just float it around.
Yeah, sure. We've for those of you that have seen the regulations, you've seen that we've made a good amount of changes. We've added a lot of definitions, accrued paid leave, job protection, So there's been a lot of definitions that have been brought into the new regulation. We've also expanded a bit on intermittent leave. We've done a lot of changes to the private plan exemption process, more hopefully clarification, but again, we're still getting, we're going through a lot of comments right now. We've tried to integrate the employer a bit more into the process. One of the big areas that we were faced with is job protection. I know that's probably the foremost definitional change that we've made. We've added that for a number of reasons. One, people were asking us, when does job protection begin? And those that know the statute, 175M Section 9, that speaks to job protection, and there's in essence 3 different areas. But the automatic presumption of retaliation is the most concerning. So we tried to clarify that in the regulations, that job protection begins purposes of the automatic retaliation when the employee begins leave. We've also tried to make it clear that concurrent leaves that are contemplated in the statute run with a leave that's being taken under the DFML program. We've tried to do that more clearly. Some of the things that we've said are that job protection begins when a person first takes a qualifying leave that would be eligible for a benefit under our program, regardless of whether or not the employee actually applies for benefits with us. And the importance of that is we have to make sure that employers are providing employees the notice that their leave will run concurrent. This is a requirement in the statute. Put an echo here. So we're clarifying that and making it clear that if you use leave from an employer that you don't apply for benefits with us, your job protection still begins on the day you first take leave there, and that establishes your benefit year. So there's a lot of these changes that we've come up with. We hope they're viewed as providing greater clarity, particularly to employers and employees. But that's my quick narrative of that.
I just want to add a couple of things. One in particular that jumps out at me, Bill, and you may remember my first interaction with Bill he actually really impressed me. I sent a question through the website, the MassGov website, and I emailed it not knowing whether it would get to anybody. It was one of those general questions, and it had to do with the 1099 workers, the independent contractors. And it had been a problem for a number of my clients, and I reached out thinking that the message would just go into the ether. I might never hear from anyone. And lo and behold, Bill called. It was helpful for 2 reasons. One, when Bill called, I happened to be on vacation, and I was on a run with my wife, and I was not happy about having to go for a run, but my wife's a really good runner, and she convinced me to go. I was way, way behind her. And so when Bill called, I was able to have a perfect excuse to say to my wife why I stopped in the middle of the run. And we had a great conversation about the 1099 workers, and he actually clarified at that time where his department was planning on going with this issue. And the new changes to the regulation are very helpful in that regard. So there had been confusion about these 1099 workers, and some of you on the call or on the webinar may have confronted this. It was whether a general independent contractor would be considered covered by the new law, and the original regulations weren't clear on that point. And Bill told me at that time that as long as someone is properly classified as an independent contractor under Chapter 151A of the Massachusetts law, then the employers would not need to make contributions, and those types of contractors would not be eligible under the statute with respect to, they would not be considered a covered contract worker. And what's helpful about the new regulations is that it specifically identifies that you have to be an independent contractor under Chapter 151A of the law. I mean, if you are an independent contractor under 151A of the law, then you're not covered and not eligible for benefits. So it's a little bit of a trick because you have to be careful as an employer. I think this is one of the things that I deal with regularly. Employers trying to characterize a worker as an independent contractor when they don't meet that three-part definition under state law. So I would be careful as an employer not to just move someone over into the independent contractor category just because you think that it might give you an exemption for that worker under the state leave law, because it's a dangerous trap. I think most people who work for someone, a business, are actually considered an employee. That's the presumption. And the analogy I like to give about 1099 workers is if you perform a task that's regularly within the scope of what the employer does. So for example, in a law firm, we have paralegals who work with us, and that's part of what a law firm, that's part of what the business of a law firm is. So we, under category 2 or element 2 of the statute, we couldn't characterize that paralegal as an independent contractor. However, if we use someone to clean the windows of our building, and right now they're probably pretty dirty because none of us have been in there for months, but if we had someone come in and clean the windows of our building, that person would not be an employee, they would be an independent contractor because they are not performing services that are usually within the scope of our business. So the 1099 miscellaneous worker clarification, I think, is the most important one from my perspective, and I think is helpful for businesses in Berkshire County. So thank you, Bill, for clarifying that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention one of the other things that Bill spoke about, and has to do with the presumptive retaliation. You know, when some of us were going to workshops early on in this process, when we heard that, that was kind of a scary phrase for us to hear. And so, you know, when the wording was something like the negative changes in status or adverse action taken against employees during leave or within 6 months of coming back from leave would presume to be retaliatory, I think a lot of us focused on that. So I appreciated in the proposed regulations the clarification around that and the narrowing of that. I think the original regulations always stated that if the employer can provide clear and convincing evidence of non-retaliatory reasons, you know, for the change in status, that was helpful. But the proposed regulations talk also about if an employer has a bona fide belief that the employee is committing fraud in filing their claim, that's not, you know, considered a retaliatory circumstance, that if something is trivial or minor, that minimally impacts the employee's work, that it won't constitute an adverse action. And then just reminding us as employers that pre-existing employment rules and policies being supported as the basis for adverse reactions or change in status is going to be helpful to us when we're trying to make sure that we're not presumed to be retaliatory in any actions during the leave or following the leave. So as an employer, as an HR individual, I really appreciated the clarification of that in the proposed regulations.
Yeah, I agree, Michele. The retaliation piece is important. Bill, I'd love to know your thoughts, because there's one piece of it that says that if an employer informs your department about that they have a belief that the covered individual has committed some type of fraud in applying for benefits, it won't give rise to a retaliation claim. So what do you anticipate the process will be in your department if our clients believe that?
Well, the process itself involves the employer, and that's a statutory requirement. So when we receive a claim, we're supposed to reach out to the employer within 5 days of receipt of that claim. And we're developing the process now, but that process will include, among other things, is this your employee? Have they used any prior leave usage in the past 12 months, with the exception of the first year when we open up, among other things. At that point, the employer is free to provide us at that time with anything that they believe should play a role in our determination. Whether or not, we follow that recommendation, we don't want to necessarily get into battles between an employer and employee over the fact that that employee just takes Mondays and Fridays off in the summertime. But if there's something else there, and again, it's one of those things, you'll know it when you see it, but if there's, some allegation that they're actually not caring for a family member, even though they're saying that this person is a family member, then, we're obviously going to have to give some deference to that. The bigger issue is really how the courts are going to view this standard for purposes of retaliation, because in there it says under a bona fide belief, if they inform us of something, does the employee have a section 9A, B, or C count in their complaint to go after the employer? Again, we're not the rules of procedure in Massachusetts. The courts are free to take that, obviously, as a regulation, as under advisement. So where it goes after it gets to us, we're trying to set the bar and at least set the standard. But again, we don't know how that's going to play out once we start really getting into these complex employer-employee relations claims that I'm sure Kevin, your firm will be astutely aware of.
Well, Michele and I have seen in our experience working together, we've seen a number of situations where we're concerned about whether employees are using leave properly. And so this one was particularly interesting to me, and I'm sure to Michele as well, because I just want to make sure that, and for employers out there, I want to make sure that if you have that feeling that maybe people are abusing this new law, you don't want to have a retaliation claim facing you if you take action in the future. And so I think it's great that you've given some background information about how we could deal with notifying you or being involved in the process, because I do think that may come up. The other thing that I think is interesting, Bill, is the intermittent leave. I would love to know your perspective about the 15-minute increment, because some of the HR people out there that I work with in the Berkshires are concerned about the tracking of the 15-minute increment. So basically, for everyone who isn't aware, the revised regulations now indicate that intermittent leave can be taken or shall be taken in increments of 15-minute intervals. So it used to be up to, the employer could designate up to 4 hours. So I'd love to know more about that from your perspective.
This is by far the probably number one or two category of comment that we have received in this round of regulations. And we heard a lot about it. There was a need for clarification coming into us, a lot of questions leading up to the regulation draft. So we decided to eliminate or take away the 4-hour provision that was in the original set of regulations, thinking we were being helpful to employers by saying that, it may be used in 15-minute increments. However, that has just raised a wave of concerns. Everything from it should be an hour minimum, it should be an 8-hour minimum. We should follow other states like New York. So I don't have a lot to say about that right now, other than to say that there are going to probably be further revisions. I don't know if we'll remain at the 15 minutes. It may be increased. We may tweak it a bit to say that an employee cannot apply for leave unless they reach a certain threshold, like 4 hours, 8 hours, whatever the case may be. But yeah, it's a very complex issue, not just because of what the timing element is or the frequency or the interval, but also how you deal with it, for employers that are working reduced schedules or part-time schedules? What's the average weekly wage? How do you arrive at the dollar amount for purposes of paying that person for 15 minutes? So very, very challenging area of the law that we're still trying to figure out. And, you know, we may have to continue to revisit, you know, once we put these regs out, we may have to come back to it. So, you know, I'm saying a lot here and I'm not saying anything. But it's giving us, it's keeping us up at night.
Yeah. Giving you cause for thought. I can imagine you got a lot of comments about the 15 minutes. It's a sort of it's a very small, part of time to have to manage, track, and monitor.
I'd be curious what your thoughts are, if you have any ideas or recommendations that we can consider. You know, obviously we have to follow the comments that have come in, but you know, from this panel, I'd love to hear your philosophies on that issue.
Yeah, I definitely think that 15 minutes is a very small amount of time. I think it creates tracking problems. And the other issue that I'm concerned about, Bill, is the inconsistency with the Massachusetts earned sick time law. So from my perspective, it would be great if they could somehow be considered together. And when you're talking about the intermittent leave, so that we don't have that inconsistent application. So that's my perspective.
Yeah, and that's been commented a lot, and we're looking at that. And I hope to be able to, we hope to be able to make those two work together. But again, we're just exploring all the options right now. But that certainly has been an issue that has been raised a lot.
Oh, we're covering a lot of ground.
Yeah, we're skipping around. I think we touched on some of your other questions.
No, this is great. I think it works best this way. It's just flowing around as you're thinking of things that are important to comment on. I think a couple of those pieces too, where I know the question about the independent contractors, and Kevin, you really kind of got into a little bit about the definition around that. I think that's an important piece of information for our small business owners that are listening. We certainly fielded a lot of questions around that. So thank you for that oversight. The other,
and if I could,
oh sure, go ahead, Bill.
There's one point that on the 1099s. I don't know if any of you are aware of this, but the IRS came out with a new form, 1099 NEC, that went into effect on January 1st of 2020, which basically said that anybody that issues a 1099 miscellaneous using box 7 for purposes of providing income to an individual will now use 1099 NEC. So the vast majority of the income that we would see, we guess, would come in on a 1099 miscellaneous through box 7, but that now has moved over to a new form called 1099 NEC. And because of that, we have come out with some guidance that in essence says that if you are in fact issuing a 1099 NEC now instead of the 1099 miscellaneous box 7, those contributions are not required to be remitted, and that 50% rule is not applicable to the 1099 NEC. And I'll step back and say that the whole issue around 1099s, which was last year's dilemma, focused on counting a workforce that had 50 or more percent of 1099 miscellaneous contractors. So we came out with some guidance last summer, more around the independent contractor rule. This rule came out with 1099 NEC. So we further expanded, I guess, the applicability of 1099. So there's still some 1099 miscellaneous, other boxes, I think 4 and a couple of others that will still be a factor. But that 10, when Kevin was talking, I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware of the fact that there's a 1099 NEC now.
Bill, I think that's a really helpful thing, and I hope that everyone who is listening to the webinar either talks with whoever is responsible for preparing your 1099s at your business in Berkshire County, whether it's in-house or an outside accountant, that you talk with them about the 1099 NEC, because I think that's really, really helpful. So I appreciate that, Bill. And that, I think that changes things in terms of clarifying whether someone really counts as a covered worker under the paid family and medical leave.
So I just want to remind all of our listeners that we'll head into the Q&A shortly, but if you have any questions at this point in time, please use that Q&A function and submit them. We want to give everybody an opportunity to have, even something super specific. Don't be afraid to ask. We take advantage of the opportunity to have one of these panelists speak to that. I wanted to ask a question about the private policies. I know one of the ways that compliance can be met is by getting a private policy rather than joining the state's program. Can you talk a little bit about those, and also what happens if an employer changes their mind and wants to go back to the state program after that?
Is that a question for me, Jonathan?
Yeah, I guess Bill you can probably jump in.
Yeah, no, I'm just my Zoom has gone down, so good thing I called in. Yeah, so exemptions, as you said, if you have an equal or better program, this is statutory. You can file for an exemption from contributions. And we opened up the window for filing for an exemption back in April of 2019. And through our entire process through December, we received about we approved about 3,400 businesses for a private plan exemption. We've made it very clear that if you've applied for an exemption and you decide to come back to the state plan, then you're going to owe back contributions. So our renewal process for the first 3,400 or so exemptions that have been approved, the expiration for the vast majority is September 30th. But because of these regulations and because of the fact that we've done a lot of changes to the exemption section, we're going to probably extend that a couple of months, probably October, November, maybe even December, to give companies and employers and carriers enough time to come up with their policies. We've partnered with the Division of Insurance, and they've come up with a template for us, but because of these regulation changes, there may be some further changes, so that's why we're doing the extension. With that said, if an employer decides to come back to the state plan, they will in fact owe the back contributions. Now, what do we do going forward? Say it's 2022. We've tried to make it easy. And we're basically saying that if an employer leaves a private plan, they can only do so during the term of their renewal, and that their employees will be immediately covered on the state plan the first day of the first quarter following the termination, and vice versa. If somebody goes from the public plan to a private plan, private carriers have to pick up on day one. For the most part, that has been well received, but we have received a lot of comments on that nonetheless. If an employer goes from one carrier to another carrier, I think the insurance industry at least, is accepting of the fact that they have to pick up the prior carrier's business, or at least the obligations moving forward from the effective date of that policy. Other things that we've been asked about are what happens if I terminate my private plan? What about my employees that were approved for benefits prior to the termination of the plan? Very simply, that carrier owns that through the benefit year for that employee. So hopefully I've answered your question, Jonathan, and if there's any more, I'll certainly take that.
Yeah, we ended up selecting a private plan over the state plan. And if anyone out there is considering that, Bill already mentioned that you have to offer the same or more generous benefits The cost has to be the same, for the employees. You have to offer all protections and rights covered under the Mass Paid Family Medical Leave. Some of the new language in the proposed regulations clarify that you have to cover all individuals in your organization, so you can't classify people out and not cover them under the private plan. You have to have an internal appeals process that's built into your private plan, in addition to the appeals process for the department. You have to, when you issue a determination under a private plan, you have to advise the employee of their rights. I think what else was in there? Calculate the weekly benefit amount based on earnings at the time of the application of the benefits. And you can also, in a private plan, choose to only cover family, only cover medical, or cover both. So when we gravitated towards a private plan, one of the things we looked at was no payment at the time by the employer or the employee until the plan kicks in. We ended up choosing a carrier that also does our short and long-term disability, so that we feel they might be familiar with claims processing. The leave process gives us a single point of contact for leave and disability claims to simplify the claim experience, and kind of like the customer service model that we're used to from that particular insurance carrier. I'm glad to hear some clarification on what happens, if we choose to pull away from the private plan. I did notice, in the regulations, you have to reapply, for your exemption, that the department can audit your private plan. That was included in there, and then approval from the department could be withdrawn, if the terms and conditions of the plan are changed and the department's not notified or violated in some way. And that if we do not renew our private plan, we have to continue to provide paid benefits to covered employees. So just wanted to share a little bit with people that are listening out there. I'm not pitching one way or the other. I'm just kind of telling you where our thought process was in choosing a private plan and the different things that we had to consider, and also the new proposed changes to the regulations and the guidance for people who choose private plans.
Michele, that is really helpful, and I want to emphasize two parts of what you talked about. One is that you mentioned about covering the entire workforce. I think that's really important because you can't get the private plan, or the exemptions won't be granted for a private plan unless you're requesting that it's applying to the entire workforce. So the second thing is that if you're using an insurance carrier like you are at Hillcrest Educational, make sure that that insurance carrier has a license issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because if it doesn't, then you're not eligible to use that carrier. So yeah, those are additional points.
Great. I think I'll jump. We have some questions starting to compile here, so why don't we jump to one of them? We have one question submitted is, what advice do you have for employers updating and revising policies in preparation for the Massachusetts Paid Family Medical Leave?
I can jump on that one. First of all, I think it depends a little bit on how many employees you have, because the Massachusetts Paid Family and Medical Leave Act applies to almost all employers in Massachusetts, whereas the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act applies only to larger employers. So if you fall into the category that the FMLA applies to your company, then you would write a policy that that dovetails between the two. If you have a smaller company where FMLA doesn't apply, then you wouldn't have a Family and Medical Leave Act policy in place already, and you would put in place a clear policy that complies with the Mass Leave Law. So so it would vary, but for anyone out there who is interested in a sample policy, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to share it with you. I've prepared them for clients and would be happy to share them. I don't know how people would find out my email address, but I'm sure that you can post it somewhere on the webinar. But feel free to reach out. It's a good question.
You might want to check out your policies also related to sick time. I know Kevin mentioned FMLA, workers' comp, paid time off, all those types of things. guidance around looking at not just your policies, but things like your job descriptions. Ensure that they reflect the essential functions of the job, as well as any physical requirements that people are, required to have to do the job, because there is a fit for duty thing that can be put in place. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words. When somebody returns from a leave, a fit for duty evaluation is allowed to be done under certain conditions. And so it's important that your job descriptions reflect all the essential functions and all the requirements, including like the physical aspects of their jobs.
And one other point to go off of Kevin, for purposes of family leave, it's important to understand for those that are already subject to FMLA that we have a much broader definition of family member. We include domestic partners and grandparents, so that has to be part of your plan.
Yeah, one other thing to bring up, it's not really just about the policy issue, but what Bill said reminded me is that the category of what's considered a serious health condition under the FMLA may be different under the Massachusetts paid family medical leave. I noticed, Bill, in the revised regulations, there was one change about people with substance abuse issues. And I'd be interested to know, it was a very, very small change, but I think it's an important one, which may disqualify someone from considering themselves to be have a serious health condition and eligible for paid family and medical leave under your statute. So could you just go through a little bit about what that means, what that change means?
Yeah, in essence, it says that if you're not an inpatient for substance abuse, it's not considered a serious health condition. We've heard a lot of comments on that and doing that. It's currently one of the areas that we are exploring. Whether it ends up the same way or different, I'm going to say it's probably going to be different. It may not be that we require the inpatient leave. So yes, it's the rationale behind it, I guess, was, and we farmed a lot of questions throughout. Thought it was possibly an FMLA requirement, but maybe not. It's in there. The same with, we have a military exigency and a military leave about whether or not it's been an honorable or dishonorable discharge. We're looking at that too. But yeah, the substance abuse, I guess just stay tuned. We're aware of it. And, we've received a lot of comments about, particularly around COVID, allowing for telehealth. So that may be something that we incorporate as we finalize.
That's interesting.
Another question. This might be a good one for Bill to start with, but a submitted question asks, and then this actually speaks to those gray areas where there's some confusion with different benefits that employees might be qualified for. But the question is, what happens if a staff member is out on maternity leave when the paid family medical leave program begins? Does their leave then qualify for this as well?
So that's an area that, and it's not bonding. It's not just bonding, rather. It could be any other type of leave that takes place in 2020. I have a condition that happens in the fall of 2020. I used time FMLA in 2020. What happens to me in 2021? And the last round of the regulations that are currently in effect right now basically allowed us to go back 12 months, look retrospectively. Did you use any time for a qualifying reason? And then if you did, we would say you're not entitled to a leave with us. We were alerted to the fact that in doing that, we're in essence taking away time where there's been no job protection allowed. So our statute, the whole thing about job protection. So how can we deduct time for someone that used 12 weeks of bonding leave in 2020, all the while we can't give them or they can't obtain job protection under 175M. So what we did there was basically said that we have a 12-month look back. However, with the exception of the first phase of the program beginning in January 2021, we won't look back. Any leave taken after January 2021 with an employer that doesn't come to us will count against you. This is obviously probably a concern for employers because this is a stacking issue that is allowed. But again, we had to follow our law and look at it from the job protection standpoint. And that's why we ended up with that provision. I think the state of Washington has done something similarly or has a similar provision in their statute. And yeah, they got inundated with bonding claims from births in 2020. So we're aware of it, but we made that adjustment because of that reason.
Bill, I wanted to ask you one thing about retroactive application, and that relates to one of the new proposed amendments where if an employer doesn't properly assess the allowable deduction from an employee or a covered contract worker, they can't seek retroactive reimbursement to cover the cost of the assessment. Can you just go over a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was because we receive a lot of questions from employers regarding I don't have or I didn't assess my employee like I should have. I realized it after the fact, or particularly in tipped industry workers where there may not be enough to satisfy the tax obligations when you factor in our contribution. Because we were faced with a lot of questions, and because these bordered on, employee relations, labor law issues, we just weren't equipped to take a position on that other than say you can't do it. But if somebody wants to, and I've posed this question, if somebody wants to provide us with some information that says that an employer going back to an employee for missed contributions is legally permissible, we'll look at it. But right now, we don't think that it is, and that's why we've inserted that provision in the regs.
So employers in the Berkshires should just be aware that that they may have a duty to cover that cost of the contributions if they didn't collect them properly, didn't assess them to the employee, correct?
That is correct. So that means that if you fail to remit the employer share, say, of the medical, or even the employee share of the family and medical, then yeah, when you do your quarterly return through DOR, Mass Tax Connect, you're going to be responsible to remit that portion, even though you had not assessed it to, or against the employee. And surprisingly enough, I don't think there's been any comments on that particular provision from all of the comments that I've gone through. I don't think anybody raised that as a concern or that we should consider something different.
Well, thank you for all that, Bill, and thank you, Kevin, also for digging a little deeper into the detail there. Another question submitted that I thought was interesting. We have a paid time off pool for staff to donate to when a coworker is out for an extended period of time. Will that affect their claim with the Family Medical Leave Program?
So they will be using time through this pool, and it will be conceivably for a qualifying reason. I'm going to assume some things here. So if that is the case, from the purposes of a time allotment, yes, it will affect the amount of weeks that we provide coverage. So for example, if they have a 12-week bonding allowance with us, and they used 4 weeks with their employer through that pool, we would only grant 8 weeks of leave. And again, we're not getting into the benefit amounts because there's formulas there. Is the employer paying full wage replacement? Is it only doing partial? What's the difference between what we would have allowed versus what they received from that pool? So from a strict time allowance standpoint, if it's a qualifying reason, and it's a qualifying reason that we would have paid out for had it come directly to us, we will deduct.
All right, I will, one other, just a technical question, but a good opportunity for just to plug where information's available. Question submitted is, are the new regulations on the state website or available somewhere for employers to download, or are they not yet finalized and viewable?
There's the draft version of the regulations is available on our website, and I believe, and I know, we have, so let's get back to basics here. It's very important that if you want to stay, on top of this program, that you register for our newsletter. And you do that through mass.gov/DFML. And there's a place where you can sign up. Any alerts that we send out, you'll be among the first that will see that. Mary Tibma, our communications person, is on the phone listening in as well. She's the one that handles all of the website updates and distribution of those materials. We announced the draft regs about a month ago. There was a link right to the regs, and I believe they are still uploaded on our website in the draft form. When we finally come to resolution and all the changes that we've taken in and updated the regulations, they will be posted there probably before they even become effective with the Secretary of State, just more as a matter of convenience.
Yeah, just to clarify, Jonathan, they definitely are up on the website. And what's nice about them is that if you go to them, they're redlined, so you can see the changes from the previous version. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. That made it really helpful to try to figure out what was taken out, what was added, and I did end up reviewing that in some detail. And also the website in general, it's set up very well for people, either whether you're an employer or an employee, to find volumes of information. So as an employer, I really do appreciate how the website's been set up.
Great.
And just to point, want to thank, groups like yours, Jonathan. We've been doing these 60 or 70 or so in the last year throughout the state. And you know what? These are our greatest resource when it comes to us being enlightened of your concerns and things that we may not be getting right completely. So I want to thank you in allowing us to speak here today.
No, we appreciate it, and also just the heavy lift today, Bill. A lot of these questions are obviously directed for your insight at the onset, just because you really are a true primary source here as we're talking about paid family medical leave. So we really appreciate the generosity with your time. Why don't we, we've kind of completed the questions that have been submitted so far. So I did want to save a few minutes to just kind of go around the horn and give each of you an opportunity to weigh in on anything that we might have missed, or maybe just provide, a key piece of advice for the type of listeners that we have, small business owners and people just trying to figure out what their next step might be. Maybe we could start with Kevin.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to take a quick look at the website, as Michele mentioned, because it's really helpful. If you have any questions about how this will work, and as you work your way through the website, I think it'll really give you a good insight on exactly what the process is. In terms of the amendments, one thing we haven't spoken about, but the amendments do clarify some of the filing requirements about what an individual filing an application for benefits has to provide to the DFML. They have to show proof that the employer has been notified. They have to give the name of the individual taking the leave, or if they're caring for someone, they have to name that individual. They have to disclose the start date, anticipated start date of the leave, and then the anticipated length of the leave and type of leave, and then when they expect to return. And also the revised regulations talk about that you can file an application for benefits no more than 60 calendar days prior to the start date of the leave, and if not possible, as soon as practicable after. So I think those are important things for employers to keep in mind when you're educating your workforce about the leave. And again, I just want to reiterate how much I appreciate the input that Bill's providing, the primary source information. It's really helpful. And I think Michele's points about the private plan were terrific, especially for people who haven't considered it before. It's worthwhile. So thank you both.
Thank you, Kevin. Michele, any last thoughts that you'd like to pass along?
We have a little bit more than 6 months to go, before the first part of it gets implemented. So, to the employers out there in HR, individuals, I know you've already prepared already. You've done things like put your posters up, had your employees sign notifications, have them on file somewhere so they can be seen if asked for. You've begun either paying into the fund or have your private option figured out, gone to tons of seminars and things like that. Just really take a peek at all of your policies, go through them, especially those related to disciplinary policies and procedures. And don't forget to do things like train your managers and supervisors in performance management and the consistent application of disciplinary policies. Give them a little bit of training on presumptive retaliation and what that means, and their requirements and responsibilities under the mass paid leave. Lots of seminars are going to pop up again, in regard to that. Employer associations are extremely valuable in providing you with some information and some guidance. And this isn't a shameless plug for Kevin Kinne, but lean on the expertise of your employment attorney for guidance. We do it all the time, and it's very helpful. And I thank you for allowing me to be part of the panel. This was a valuable experience for me as well. Not only was I able to talk from the perspective of the employer and an individual in HR, but I certainly learned a lot from listening to the others and hearing your questions.
Well, Michele, thanks so much for your time and insight this morning. And certainly, navigating this program for an employer the size of Hillcrest, I'm sure you've put a lot of time and energy into this, so we appreciate you sharing some of that. And I just want to clarify that at 1Berkshire, we're all for shameless plugs when supporting our local businesses. And business
Thank you, Michele.
I'm glad
You're welcome.
Anything you want to wrap up with, Bill?
Yeah, we just very quickly, we're in the process of developing our claims adjudication system. So we didn't really talk a lot about that, but we're going to hopefully, we will by January 1st have an online portal where employees and employers can log in. We're going to have a call center, and we're going to have a claims adjudication software company assist us with processing these claims. So with respect to that, keep tuned over the next few months, because we're going to probably start up our call center sometime in the fall. And we hope to do even a soft launch on December 1st, whereby employees can file a certain select group of claims, let's just say bonding, on December 1st. That'll give us a little bit of on-the-job training, see how the systems are working before we go live, and maybe try to deal with some of the onslaught of claims earlier. So all of these things are going on. We hope to have more virtual sessions on how our system works, how it interacts, how people can fill out information. We're going to be doing that hopefully in the upcoming months, likely going to be virtual because of the COVID situation, and we won't be out on the road in person, but stay tuned.
Great. And with that, we've reached 9:30. We're directly on time. So I think we've reached our conclusion, this morning's virtual town hall. The first thing I want to do is I just want to thank our listeners that called in and viewed this webinar this morning. And I also want to thank my fellow team members at 1Berkshire for putting this together. Ben Lamb is the man behind the curtain doing the tech for this webinar, as always, very seamlessly. And I'd really like to just sincerely thank each of you, our panelists, for Kevin and Michele and Bill, for your time this morning, early on a Friday. But this is this is a lot of expertise that you've lended as a service here to some small business folks and other listeners, and we really appreciate that.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Just a couple of additional updates. This will be viewable later today on the 1Berkshire website, along with the rest of our Town Hall Series webinars. And this will also be made available for public viewing on Pittsfield Community Television. So if anybody that missed it, please take an opportunity to pass it along and view this content. Our virtual Town Hall Series will actually be on hiatus next week. We don't have a topic for next week, so we'll be back the week of the 4th of July 4th, probably with an off date webinar because of the July 4th holiday falling on Friday. We'll probably do something on Wednesday or Thursday of that week. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. So I wanna thank everybody again. And it's gonna be a beautiful weekend in the Berkshires. I encourage all of our listeners to get out there and enjoy the beautiful outdoors safely, support your local businesses, and just thank you all for what you're doing. Be safe and be well. Thanks.